Good afternoon. I would just like to start by thanking the organizer for inviting UN Habitat to this very much important discussion about the future of our cities. I'm Vincent Kitio, as have been presented. I'm heading the Urban Energy Unit at UN Habitat. UN Habitat is the UN agency that is in charge of promoting sustainable urbanization and also to promote adequate shelter for all. And you will be asking yourself why urban energy in the sustainable urban development, why Habitat has a unit that is focusing on urban energy. I'll just say that for many years, Habitat has been seeing energy as a sectoral theme that should be handled by engineers. But the reality is that our city today consumes more energy than any other area. More than 75% of energy is consumed in cities, and city also contributes 70% of greenhouse gas emission. And therefore, we cannot ignore the fact that city is contributing a lot on climate change, in creating climate change, but at the same time, city also have solution to address climate change. So that's why for us at UN Habitat, we realize that we need to be part of the solution rather than to be part of the problem. My presentation today will be on how do we therefore promote urban energy, as well as also how do we design neighborhoods, taking into consideration the consumption of resources, because we are not just focusing on the energy aspect, but we are also looking into issue of resources. Let me, I will start this presentation by giving you the global picture. And this is perhaps just to summarize what has been said before. We are, at this juncture, living in an urbanizing world, whereby more than half of the global population is living in cities. And while we have more than 50% of European or 60% of European living in city, in Africa, for example, we have 40% of the population are living in cities. And when we look at those data, we also realize that most of the population that are living in the city in developing countries are living in informal settlement, unplanned settlement. They are also the part of the population that we also call energy poor, because they do not have sufficient resources. And what is also driving this rapid urbanization is population growth, and also rural-urban migration. At the same time, we also seeing that as cities are developing faster, the urbanization is happening in the absence of planning. So there are not adequate planning. There are also resources are not enough. Resources that the local government are having are not enough to provide essential services. And at the same time, this growth is also compromised by the impact of climate change. As you know, climate change, although the global south did not contribute a lot on climate change, but they are all affected. So we are in the same boat. And we need to all address the issue of climate change. That's why it became very important. So in terms of climate change impacts in our city, we are seeing the same effects of climate change, increasing threats, sea level rise. We have seen, for example, coastal cities that are, their housing are being devastated, destroyed by the sea level rise. Flooding are even happening in cities that traditionally were not flooded. So again, we need to do something. We also see the urban heat island effect is also happening in the global south. At the same time, increased energy demand for cooling and heating. But in the absence of planning, in the absence of energy planning, in the absence of also energy generation. The other element, which we cannot avoid to talk about it, is a housing deficit that is taking place in the global south. Today, 1.6 billion people are living in an inadequate housing. Remember, I mentioned that Habitat has two mandates, promoting sustainable urbanization and adequate shelter for all. And the right to housing and adequate housing was included in the human right in 1948. So it has been there for a long time, and we need to address that. So there is a significant shortage of adequate housing, affordable, and also the quantity of housing that we have are not enough to address that. Like I mentioned earlier on, cities are also contributing to climate change because of the resources that cities are consuming. We are seeing cities like Nairobi, for example, the effect, the fact that the urban population in Nairobi consume firewood for cooking, and this firewood has to come from somewhere. That's why we are seeing forests being destroyed because of firewood for cooking, firewood used as a fuel. So again, continuing in the challenges of urbanization, we could also mention the issue of the environmental challenge, which is one of the key issues because of what of the pressure on resources that is not accompanied, that is not followed by a rapid, a rational production of this, rational demand management of these resources. We are also seeing that urban population are heavily relying on natural resources, material, water, wood, as I mentioned, leading to environmental degradation through uncontrolled extraction. And the way our cities are planned, a city in the global south I mentioned, is that there are a lot of horizontal expansion of cities with low density, and where the single family homes are very frequent because of the tradition in most, and this is happening in most of developing countries because people own the house, people own the land, people don't own the house. And that's why it becomes difficult to really promote densities. And we need also to start talking about convincing people to go for densities. Like I mentioned earlier on, we also have a huge deficit of housing. But also, importantly to say that most of the buildings that even exist today are poorly designed. They were not designed using passive building methods. I'm talking about urban buildings, whereby in the rural area we could see vernacular architecture that are really environmentally friendly. But at the same time, let's also say that urbanization is also an historic opportunity to build better. And that's why we are here. And my colleague will go through the different solutions that Habitat has been developing so as to promote sustainable urbanization. Why opportunity? If we look at what will be happening in 2050, just 25 years from now, where the global population will be 75% of the global, 70% of the global population will be living in cities. If we have looked into future, we will realize that our statistics show that 60% of the houses that will be standing in the global south are yet to be built. So this is a huge opportunity to do better, to plan those buildings, include taking into consideration passive building design, clean energy use, and also proper management of cities. So there is a need of a paradigm shift. If we are to build this 60% housing stock and applying whatever lesson that we are hearing today into the new housing design, into the new city design, into the new neighborhood design, we will be in a position of reducing the emission of greenhouse gas, and also at the same time also promoting sustainability in the whole system, while also fighting poverty, because these are also opportunities for economic development. So our solution mostly are integrated solution, integrated strategy. We cannot work in isolation. We need to work in an holistic way, where we bring mobility into the equation, we bring inclusion into the equation, we also bring climate change in the equation. We cannot just work in isolation, just identify one of the elements without integrating the other element. So proper housing and neighborhood design principle need to be environmentally friendly and also be climate neutral, because that is the issue. So addressing the shortage of building, there is also addressing the shortage of housing. We need also to look into the professionals that are working in the sector. And today, 80% of the buildings that you found in the global south are built by non-professional, non-architects. We need to train more architects and provide to them the proper guiding principle, and that will help us to address some of these key issues. So housing and new neighborhood planning can also become the opportunity, economic opportunity, because it will create jobs, it will create circular economy, it will also address other social issues. What UN Habitat, together with other UN agencies and other development partners, are now talking is about the urban shift and the energy transition. We cannot continue with business as usual. In the business as usual scenario, you will find that building design that are adapted for the north climate are transformed, are replicated in the south climate. We need to stop those type of photocopying what is not adapted to the local climate. So for that reason, UN Habitat has developed a lot of tools, building design methodology, policy as well, to assist implementing sustainable urban development goal globally. And this is not just for the global south, but it's also good for the global north. And in fact, of recent, we have been also very much working in the crisis, like Ukraine. We have a team of staff working there, applying this methodology that are context specific, and that also respond to the the need of buildings that really respond to the surrounding ecosystem. So the presentation that we have today, we will just share with you one of our tools, the methodology that we are using to develop neighborhood. And these methodologies can be very well integrated in the global north, in the global south, as well as also emerging economy. I will just also say that the world has a narrow windows to build resilience. Like I mentioned, it is very important. Whatever we do today, we need to know that climate change is with us. But we are also living in the society where there are a lot of inequality existing. So we need to promote inclusiveness, equitable, and also look into prosperity so that the future city that we are all aspiring should be all inclusive, but at the same time also resilience. So the methodology that we present here, like I mentioned, it's something that is as well, it's not just for the global south, but it's also well that it can also be adapted for the global north. So without further ado, I would like to invite my colleague Yassine, who will take you through the methodology that we have developed. And then I hope that during the Q&A time, you will be also able to ask more questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vincent, for setting the framework. Well, in the second part of the presentation, I will try to maybe answer the nagging question, why urban form matters. And beside the fact that I am an urban planner and I have a bit of a bias to that, but I strongly believe that the urban form is not neutral. The structure of our city determines the amount of emissions, the infrastructure costs, the opportunities and the resilience. And once the form is built, it kind of locks in the impact for decades. And when we're talking about form, it's not only the physical form, but we also talk about land use. We talk about distribution, about proximity to services, about diversity, intensity, and connectivity as some of the indicators that we take into account when trying to embed everything that we were talking about today about energy and efficiency into the urban form from the very beginning. All right, I'll do it the old way. Also doesn't work. Okay, I'm going back. Can you help me with that? It's a bit slow. Okay, it's just a bit slow. Right. So as I said, the urban form actually dictates how far people must travel. It dictates whether we can walk, cycle, or use public transport. How much energy building consumes through ventilation or through shading or through exposure. Also the land lost or preserved carbon sink when we're talking about forests or green spaces in the city that might be consumed while the city is expanding. And of course, it also decides when we're talking about land use and mixed use development, it decides the economic vibrancy of the city. I think I'm going to suffer a little bit today. Okay, good. And one of the first elements that we were talking about is the block itself, the size of the block, and also the notion of compactness and density. And in all the research and the projects we worked on, it was very obvious that compact, walkable, and transit-connected cities emit 2 to 3 times less CO2 per capita than sprawling or car-dependent designs. But again, when we're talking about compactness, it only works when it is mixed or coupled with fine-grained development, with diversity of typologies and bioclimatic form. All right. What? Am I doing something wrong? It only goes forward, and now it's like I'm in the middle of the presentation. All right, can you please? Yes, we're here. Yeah, I keep pressing. So again? So I should also point to it. Yeah. And here is kind of a very classical example of the choices, how the choices we make in terms of design, either as an architect or planners, how that choice in terms of form dictates the emission and the energy consumption of the building. So here is just an example showing with the same plot size, with the same housing units, with the same population, how the different forms give you different quality of space, give you different energy consumption, and different also urban constellations. And this is a comparison done in the Chinese context between the energy consumption, looking at the traditional fine-grain courtyard typology, the grid typology, and the super block, super high-rise building. And it always shows that the high-rise super blocks are usually more energy, they consume more energy, either embodied transportation or operational energy. Now it works. And just to go a little bit into the details, the operational costs of what you see here in the 20 stories plus buildings are much higher than any other typology starting from the 6-story one. The travel distance or the travel energy consumed is usually 3 times higher in super blocks, in super high-rise blocks. That means that with huge blocks, you actually design the city to be car dependent. You oblige people to travel long distances to access services. And of course, also the embodied energy in terms of construction is much higher. There's also an economic cost to that. This is also in the Chinese context, where we can see a correlation between the intersection density. That means like the smaller the plots, the more intersections, street intersections you have. And that's the kind of an indicator we use to analyze the fine-grained development. So you see here in the old kind of structure, which in a Chinese city with more intersections and small plots and more commercial walkable streets, it has more intersections than when we look at the kind of super blocks. But what is interesting is that also correlates with the economic density per square meter when we compare a dense compact area with a super block. And also the kind of activities and the cost of the streets is sometimes also 11 times higher when we look at the GDP per square meter. Design in cities or neighborhoods also starts by understanding how people move and live. And this is just an interesting example about how the street structure also dictates the movement and also the distance of transportation between one point to another. Of course, the cul-de-sac or the gated community typology would always rank the worst because it actually obliges you to move around, while in a more kind of a fine-grained development within a block, you can move from point A to point B to services in a more direct and shorter distances. And that kind of summarizes in a way what we call lately the 15-minute city, where you try actually to find short ways and distances to services. we also developed a few benchmarks that could help planners to assess the efficiency and the performance of their designs, especially when we're talking about proximity and diversity and mixed-use development. For instance, talking about the street density or the intersection density that we talked about, we usually have a benchmark of hundreds intersections per square kilometer. When it comes also to the kind of uses that you want to have within a single block. So we kind of a good ratio between retail, residential use, and public facilities, and of course also avoiding single-use blocks as much as possible. There is also, when we're talking about diversity, it's not the diversity of form, but also the diversity in terms of social mix. And there are also a few benchmarks that try to ensure that different classes and different groups, income groups are, sorry for using the word class, but different income groups are integrated in the plan. And of course, the densification and the compactness also gives you different opportunities to design or to integrate public space in different forms, and also design cities that are more pedestrian friendly and more pedestrian oriented rather than car oriented. These are examples from Barcelona. This one is from Istanbul, but it's also important to look at streets themselves not only as ways to connect neighborhood, but also as active public spaces with their amenities and active frontages, and a kind of a diversity of uses as well. Design with nature, I think it was well covered in the morning keynote speech, but it's also extremely important to integrate it from the very beginning, both in terms of nature-based solutions when we're talking about ventilation corridors or using water for cooling, or spraying, or also having a really important study of exposure to the sun and shading and so on. And these are kind of a basic elements that we architects are learning at school, but we tend to kind of forget them once we are in the professional life, looking at all the other constraints, but they are extremely important elements. We talked about ecosystem services in the morning. This is an example from Singapore as well, where public spaces and green spaces are used for flood mitigation. This is an example from Stuttgart, where wind corridors are preserved in order to ensure a good ventilation of the hilly city. And of course, also the integration of green spaces, both at the building scale and also the public space one. So this brings me somehow to our framework that we are using in the Urban Lab in Habitat. And that actually focuses on the neighborhood, because it's an interesting scale where form and function come together. Especially when we're talking about the human scale, and also when we're talking about implementation and action. This is a really interesting scale where the population or the community has a direct contact with the urban actions. So this framework we call My Neighborhood, and it was a way, actually, in the very beginning, it was initiated as an idea to translate everything that we're talking about when we mention SDGs, about sustainability goals and national frameworks and these kind of very universal recommendations and frameworks. And what we try to do is to translate them into spatial indicators, into spatial aspects that are quantifiable and can be used also for the design. So we came up with 5 objectives, general 5 city objectives, which are compact, connected, inclusive, vibrant, and resilient city. And these kind of 5 objectives, they embed what we mentioned before, what we talk about, how to bring in the form, the urban form, the distribution, the proximity, and the connectivity, and so on. And it gets quite interesting, because then we use the city objectives, the 5 city objectives, but we also intersect them with 4 urban scales. We talk about here about neighborhood, street, open public spaces, and the building unit. And once you crisscross them, you get this matrix, which is a way for us to say, to identify or to analyze how an impact, for instance, in the intersection of compact and neighborhood can also have an influence on other objectives or other scales. So this kind of interaction and the understanding of how different actions and ways to achieve these objectives can interact with other different initiatives. And then when we go deeper into that, we have a set of spatial indicators under each objectives. So for example, when we're talking about compactness, we focus on urban density, what are the benchmarks that we use for the analysis of the urban form, the infrastructure network provision, the proximity to services, and it's similar to other objectives. So each one of them, under each objective, we have a set of key aspects, but also sub-key aspects with measurable indicators. And these are the indicators that we use in our projects. First, to analyze. For example, this is a project in Khorog in Tajikistan, where we try to integrate urban resilience in the plan of the city. And we start, for instance, using these indicators and frameworks to identify the deficits in terms of accessibility to services in this case, and use the same indicators to simulate and identify how we can strategize the planning process. Same thing when we do analysis on densification, on improved accessibility, and so on. And we compiled all this in a kind of a book, in a report on guidelines, and that you can check online, but this is just the structure where we provide the objective, the principles under it, but also different recommendations under each scale and street, which helps the planners and the architects to identify elements that are important to take into consideration. This is the QR code, and you can check it online. But we started with the first version of My Neighborhood, which is kind of universal, and it looks at kind of planning and gives recommendations without focusing too much on the context. But we started also kind of developing different contextual guidelines. So for instance, one that we finished and now it's published is My Neighborhood for Mountainous Cities. And that was based on the projects that we worked on in Central Asia, which were mainly in mountainous areas. And we tried to see how these city objectives and all their recommendations can be translated into a mountainous context where everything about proximity and compactness has a different meaning. We're talking about topography, we're talking about a specific climatic and economic condition. We also developed, tried to make it kind of more of a visual document that includes different recommendations on resilience, on structure, on how to manage urban sprawl and urban expansion, how to deal with snow, maybe that would help in the context of Switzerland, but also with building in slopes and so on. We also try again to embed these elements, the climatic elements in the urban design from the early on and having them embedded in the planning process, starting from the street orientation, how the impact of tall buildings, and also using natural ventilation for buildings. And we use that in a kind of a complex process, going from indicators to collecting data, to strategizing, working with the community to translate that into neighborhood designs which kind of follow the same framework. These are just two different concepts from Central Asia to the Middle East. And we also have a participatory component of my neighborhood, and that's a kind of a way that we involve the community from the very early on. So we have it throughout the whole project. We developed a card game to generate ideas and visions, but also different participatory tools to engage kids, elderly, and different target groups and involve them in the process. Just some key takeaways. Again, as we said, that the urban form is not neutral and is important to integrate it from the early on. The neighborhoods are the scale of transformation, as we mentioned, because they actually ensure that connectivity between the human scale and the urban interventions. Integration cross scales, that's also what we try to embed in the My Neighborhood framework, where you have the urban strategy or the master plan of the city, but how that translates into neighborhood interventions. The density should be also be coupled with diversity of typologies and bioclimatic forms. Streets are extremely important, especially when we're talking also about ecosystem services and how they can be seen as spaces to integrate green infrastructure, but also a place for vibrancy and economic vibrancy. Nature should be also included, looking at different contexts and different climatic situations, and also the topic about governance, which is, I think it's an umbrella, it's a cross-cutting topic of how do you ensure the implementation. This is a set of publications that we have developed that look more at the energy aspects of planning, and some of them are really interesting and really go into the details of the technical details at the architecture and the planning scale. All right, so this is all from my side. We will have a workshop tomorrow on My Neighborhood where we will go deeper into the framework, and we try to play the game as well. And we're open to your questions as well.